Hebrews chapter 5. This is actually, we're going to look at the first 10 verses of chapter 5. It's actually a pretty straightforward text. It's not all that difficult to understand. I don't know how you feel, but I feel as we take Hebrews this way in these small little chunks, it's like building blocks, and to me, it makes pretty good logical sense. The hardest part is remembering each time where all those building blocks. But so this is a pretty straightforward text, and it kicks off what is really the main theology of the book of Hebrews. So chapter 5, verse 1, all the way through chapter 10, verse 18. It is that section of Scripture that is really the main point and the main theological argument of the book of Hebrews. And just to kind of show you what I mean by that, this chapter 5, verse 1 through chapter 10, verse 18 has, and again, I think I mentioned this last week in another context, but that section has like brackets or bookends to it. So let me show you chapter 4. This is what we taught last week. Look at verse 14, 15, and 16. I'm going to read it kind of slowly, and then we're going to read the other bracket. I want you to see what I mean, how closely these are connected. So chapter 4, verse 14, seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted like as we, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Now, flip over to chapter 10 and verse 19. And this is the end of the section, so that was the beginning of the section. The end of the section, listen to how closely the two resemble one another. Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new living way which he consecrated for us through the veil that is his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience, our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful, and let us consider one another in order to stir up good works. So you can see both of those brackets or bookends are talking about our high priest, talking about coming boldly, talking about holding on to our confession, talking about entering the presence of God. So those are the bookends to what is now this whole theological argument about our rights, our privilege of coming into God's presence, and it's all because we have a great high priest. So you'll notice these two texts, and I put it in your notes, verses 14 through 16 of chapter 4 tells us that we have a sinless high priest who has gone into heaven. And the second text that I read to you, chapter 10, verses 19 through 25, tell us we have a great high priest who now takes us into heaven. All right, that's the end of the argument. In verses 14 through 16, we have a high priest who's gone there, and now we're going to begin with chapter 5, verse 1. And at the end of the argument, it's going to be now we can come into his presence as well. So the first movement now, so this, I want you to kind of, matter of fact, let me just do it like this. So we are looking at this large section that begins in 5:1 and goes through 10:18. All right, and it's bracketed by 4:14 through 16 and 10:19 through 24. Those are the brackets to this large section. But then this section that we're going to start dealing with today actually has two movements. And the first one is chapter 5, verse 1 through 7:28, I think is the right, yes. And then the second one would then be all the way through chapter 10, verse 18. So we're going to be looking at this, but specifically at this, and even this section is going to be broken down over the next 4 or 5 weeks. And I have that in your notes as well. So the first movement of this large theological section, which is 5:1 through 7:28, is about, and here's what I want you to get, it's in your notes, is about the appointment of the Son of God as our great high priest. And as a superior, that's the whole thing, or a better high priest than they had in the old covenant. All right, this whole thing is about better. Jesus is better. The tabernacle or the temple is better in heaven. The sacrifice is better. That's the whole theme of Hebrews. So now this first movement, 5:1 through 7:28, is about the appointment of the Son, who is a superior, a better high priest. And that section is also bracketed as well. Let me show you what I mean. There's this general statement. Look at chapter 5. We'll read this again in just a minute when we start going through this verse by verse. But look at 5:1. All right, chapter 5, verse 1. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sin. Now, go to the end of this section, look at chapter 7 and verse 26, and again listen to how similar this sounds. For, verse 26, chapter 7, such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens, who does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices for his own sin and then for the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up many. For the law appoints as high priests men who have weakness, but the word of oath, which came after the law, appoints the Son who has been perfected forever. So at the beginning of this, it talks about how earthly priests are appointed. When we get to the end of us, it's going to show us how Christ was appointed. He didn't have to have all of these restrictions because he met all of those qualifications to begin with. So here's what I want you to think. This large section's bracketed. Now this section, 5:1 through 7:28, is also bracketed by 5:1 through 3 and 7:26 through 28. And that's kind of how we can kind of keep our thinking together. Now inside this movement, 5:1 through 7:28, there are actually three different issues that we're going to deal with. The first one is chapter 5, 1 through 10, which we will look at today. That's going to be the focus of our attention today. And then 5:11 through 6:20, we're actually going to do that in 2 weeks. You will not want to miss these two lessons, all right? Well, maybe you will want to miss these two lessons, come to think of it, all right? All right, this first section here that we're going to deal with today, it talks about how the Son of God is taken from among humans and is appointed as the high priest, and it's going to end with after the order of Melchizedek, and then it's going to leave us hanging until we get to chapter 7, all right? So that's all we're going to do today is here, and it'll be the second time, I think, or maybe the third time we've heard that, and it's left it dangling. You figure out later what it means, all right? Then we're going to get into this section. This is why people don't like to read Hebrews, all right? Because this gets hard. It starts by saying things like, by now, you all should have been teachers, but you've been lazy and sluggish, and you've been dull of hearing, and you still need people to feed you the milk. So he kind of slaps them in the face. And then he says, so you all need to move on to maturity. And then he says, because it is impossible. That's the word he uses. And we're not going to talk about it today. I'm just telling you what we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks. It is impossible for someone who has been enlightened, someone who has tasted of the powers of the world to come, someone who has tasted the good word of God, if they fall away, it's impossible to renew them again to repentance. And then he says, but I'm believing better things for you, all right? So that's this section here, and then at the end of this section, he'll tell us why we don't have to fall away, because we have a high priest who's made a covenant with us, and that covenant that he's made with us is better than the other covenant, and it's sealed with the oath. God gave us his word, and then he put his name on top of that. So this is how this section ends. And then finally, after all of that, we get back to explaining in 7:1 through 28, what does it mean that we're going to hear today that the Son is appointed as a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So next 3, 4, maybe 5, depends on how much we argue as we're going along, weeks, we're going to be in this section, 5:1 through 7:28. All right? So here we are, the introduction of the priesthood of Jesus after the order of Melchizedek. That's 5:1 through 10. And it's the beginning of the explanation of the high priesthood or the high priestly role of Jesus that just began in chapter 4, verse 14, when it says, seeing then that we have a high priest. All right, Jesus, the Son of God. So now he begins to explain the high priestly role of Jesus. Now, the Jews would have in no way seen Jesus as a priest. No way. And even much less a high priest. They wouldn't even have seen him as a priest, much less a high priest. And so, the author of Hebrews has to really prove this point. All right? If he's going to say to them, you've got a priest in heaven that's praying for you, he's got to somehow get over this hurdle that the Jews have, that a priest has to come out of this one tribe, and Jesus came out of the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Levi. All right, so he's got, this is quite an operation that he has to pull off. So there's 2 pieces to this study today, 5:1 through 10. 2 pieces of that, they're in your outline. How high priests are selected in general, that'll be the first part. And then how Jesus, the suffering high priest, became the author of our eternal salvation. So let's begin with just talking about, on a very surface level, because that's what the author does, what are qualifications for a high priest in the Jewish mind. Verse 1, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things that are pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. So let's just kind of work through this outline this morning. So high priests in general are appointed to serve as intermediaries between God and men. That was their role. They were the bridge builder. They were, think about the Day of Atonement. The high priest would go in and he would make atonement for the sins of the people. So that's just kind of a general understanding. So they were chosen, as your notes say, from among men to act on their behalf. A priest, you think about it, those of you who may have been raised Catholic. Catholics have priests, and in their minds, the Catholic priest is an intermediary. He's the one that goes in between humanity and God. Let me just give you an illustration. He was not called a priest, but think about Moses. I just read it this morning in my devotions, and I alluded to it a couple of weeks ago in Exodus 20 when Moses said, God wants to speak to all of you. And what did the people say? You go talk to God and tell us what he says. And so the Bible says in Exodus 20:20, the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So a priest in the Jewish mind was an intermediary, somebody that was between holy God and broken, sinful humanity. Now, there were 2 things specifically that the text says. Look at this, verse 1, taken from among men and appointed for men, or appointed for man. So taken among men means they had to have solidarity with humanity. In other words, they had to be a man, had to be chosen from humanity. Actually, the Hebrew word, or the Greek word, is ex-anthropon. Anthro is man. Ex-anthropon means that they are humanity. They are like humanity. They have solidarity with humanity. So the first thing was they had to be a man, and then they were appointed, notice, for men in things pertaining to God. That is, that they were appointed to represent man, and the Greek word there is huperanthropon, all right? So you have ex-anthropon, which means that the priest has solidarity with humanity, and huperanthropon means the priest represents humanity. So those are the two qualifications specifically. Now it is interesting, in the Old Testament, a priest was Jewish, obviously, number one. They were male, number two. They were chosen from the household of Aaron, number three. But there is no mention here of any of those requirements. Didn't say they had to be a male. Didn't say they had to be from Aaron's tribe or Aaron's family. Doesn't say that they had to be Jewish. It simply says they had to have solidarity with humanity, and they had to represent humanity. Later, the text is going to say Jesus didn't come from the same family Aaron did. And because he didn't, it's making it clear here that's not one of the divine requirements. So the focus here is the priest's solidarity with those he represents. He is taken from among men. He is appointed to represent men. It implies activity. He is the priest does something for humanity. He's engaged. There is activity on the part of the priest. And so the scope in which priests represent or assist humanity, notice verse 1, is in things pertaining to God. So the priest has to be in solidarity with humanity, and he represents humanity in things pertaining to God. I know this is oversimplification, but I want to make sure we get this text. This is how it starts off. So it has to be a man, has to be a human, have solidarity with us, and he represents us in divine things, in holy things, in things that have to do with God. And specifically then, in verse 1, specifically to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. That was integral to Israel's priest, and it is central to the work of Jesus as our great high priest. He's offering sacrifice for our sin, all right? This is a real simple case that the author of Hebrews is making, but keep in mind, he just try to put yourself in the shoes and the robes of these Jewish people sitting there. They are Jewish, but they have converted to Christ, and they are being encouraged to go back to Judaism. And the author is trying to say, no, you have a great high priest who came from the tribe of Judah and was crucified. This is hard for them, and so he's building a case. That's what I want you to hear. So we begin with verse 1. Now verse 2, speaking to this priest, he can have compassion on those who are ignorant. How many are glad Jesus has compassion on the ignorant? Aren't you? Have compassion on the ignorant and those who are ignorant and who are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. All right? So let me make this real simple. A high priest in Israel had to be one that could have compassion on those who had sinned, because he himself had sinned. He himself had struggled before. Now, the word compassion that we have in verse number 2 in the English Standard Version, it literally is the word he must deal gently with. And that's actually a really good translation. The Greek word, I put it in your notes, is metriopathio. Pathio is where we get like the word pathos, like feeling, emotion. And it means to be moderate in one's expression of emotions, all right? Not flying off the handle. It is so that it's dealing gently with. It's It's not becoming angry. It's not becoming, I can't believe you did that kind of thing. Most of us would not qualify, okay? All right, so it's dealing gently with. That's what this word metriopathio means. He has to have compassion, he has to deal gently with him, especially keeping in check emotions such as anger, but also grief. In other words, a high priest needed to have compassion, but he couldn't fall apart. I mean, you can't help somebody if they're a puddle and you're a puddle. That's not helping them. So it's like this even-keeled kind of handling of one's emotions. So they must restrain their emotions and offer sacrifices on behalf of the people that they have this even-keeled emotional bond with. Now, I want you to turn to the first 5 books of the Bible. Let's look at Leviticus first of all. I'm going to read you some verses in Leviticus, then Numbers, then Deuteronomy. This whole idea of having compassion on the ignorant and those going astray finds its origin in Leviticus 4 and verse 2. Leviticus 4, verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a person sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done and does any of them. And then there's a whole list of ways the priest is supposed to handle that. We won't read all of those. Turn to Numbers now. That's the next book in the Old Testament. Numbers 15. Numbers 15. And look at verse 22. Numbers 15:22. If you sin unintentionally and don't observe all these commandments, which the Lord has spoken to Moses, all that the Lord has commanded you by the hand of Moses from the day the Lord gave commandment and onward throughout your generations, then it will be, if it is unintentionally committed without the knowledge of the congregation, that the whole congregation shall offer one young bull as a burnt offering, as a sweet aroma to the Lord with its grain offering and its drink offering, according to the ordinance, and one kid of the goats as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for the whole congregation of the children of Israel, and it shall be forgiven them, for it was unintentional. They shall bring their offering, an offering made by fire to the Lord, and their sin before the Lord for their unintended sin. It shall be forgiven for the whole congregation of the children of Israel, and the stranger who dwells among them, because all the people did it unintentionally. And if a person sins unintentionally, he'll bring a female goat in its first year as a sin offering. So the priest shall make atonement for the person who sins unintentionally when he sins unintentionally before the Lord, to make atonement for him, and it shall be forgiven him. Now hold your finger there, and I want you to flip over to Deuteronomy, which is the next book, and look at chapter 17 and verse 12. Chapter 17 and verse 12. Now the man who acts presumptuously and will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before the Lord your God, or the judge, that man shall die, so you will put evil away from Israel. Now go back to Numbers 15 and look at verse 29. We just read all is unintentional. You shall have one law for him who sins unintentionally, for him who is native born among the children of Israel, and for the stranger who dwells among them. But the person who does anything presumptuously, whether he's native born or a stranger, that one brings reproach on the Lord, and he shall be cut off from among his people, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment. That person shall be completely cut off. His guilt shall be upon him. How many are glad you don't live in the Old Testament still? All right, that's rough language. Now we don't have time to unpack all of the law. Go back to Hebrews now. This is the reference that the writer of Hebrews is making, that the high priest, go back to chapter 5, verse 2, he can deal gently with those people who are ignorantly, unintentionally going astray, because he himself is subject to weakness. Now, there is no provision for the defiant sinner who just says, I'll do whatever I want to do. Not in the Old Testament. Now, that, by the way, and I'm only piquing your interest and giving you more reason maybe not to show up for the next 2 weeks, but that may be the reason why. It may be, the writer of Hebrews may be tipping people off for the impossibility of someone returning who has just said, no, God, I knew you once, but I don't want you anymore. Or Hebrews 10:26 says, if we sin, not unintentionally, if we sin willfully after we've received the knowledge of truth, there remains no more sacrifice for sins. Now again, don't ask me to comment any further on that yet, because I only say this, I don't think it's just a bad attitude. One moment. There's something deeper than that. But this is again, I've said all along, if there's no warning to be had here, then this is a wasted book. There is a warning to be had here, and that warning is you don't play with God. You don't. He's holy, and we're not. And so this is a little tip-off. He's talking about those people who are ignorant, those people who have gone astray. In other words, he's implying ignorance here, or unintentionality. Now we go back to the notes. I'm at 7 under B. So this is a good ground to restrain one's emotion. It's not a good priest who says, I can't believe you did that, because a priest is subject to that same weakness himself. I mean, you don't want to, I'm not a priest, nor do I want to be, and don't treat me like one, okay, please. But you don't want a pastor who says, I can't believe you did that, and hides the fact that he too has struggled with that, all right? That's the point here. So there should be a restraining. The priest, an earthly priest, needs to be able to deal gently with people because he knows that he has weaknesses too. Now again, notice the difference between the Aaronic priest, the priest out of the tribe of, or out of the family of Aaron, and the high priestly role of Jesus, because look at chapter 4 and verse 15. We do not have a high priest who cannot, remember the word sympatheo, cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but it was in all points tried like as we, yet without sin. Remember, we talked about, that means he had all the temptations we have, plus some. Remember, I made that point. He didn't just have the things that we wrestle with. He also had people saying, if you're really the Son of God, throw yourself down. If you're really the Son of God, save yourself. He had all of those, and the weight of becoming sin, all of those temptations. And so if an earthly priest can sympatheo with us, how much more this great high priest Jesus? And that's why we can come boldly and say, Jesus, I need help. And he doesn't kick us. He deals gently. Aren't you glad he deals gently? He doesn't get angry with us. He's praying for us. You see, that's the picture that's being given here. But first of all, he's got to prove to them that Jesus truly is the high priest. Now, look at verse 3. All of those things are required. Because of this, he is required as for the people, so also for himself to offer sacrifice for sins. So an earthly high priest, his life was to be exemplary, but he had to remedy his own sin by offering sacrifices for his own. He was to be an exemplary person, but he was still fallible. He was still flawed. Aaron was flawed. I mean, we know Aaron was flawed, for crying out loud, and all of the priests were flawed. So they also had to offer sacrifices for their own. So the priest, let's look at C3, was in solidarity with humanity because of his weakness and his own personal need for remedy. So, Michael, you and I could, if we were in the right tribe, we could be priests for one another because we would be in solidarity with one another. We're both human, and we both know what it means to struggle. And so I could deal gently with you, you could deal gently with me because we know what that feels like, all right? Everybody getting that so far? So that's the description given so far. Now, look at verse 4. One other thing here in this first section. The role of the high priest is not an honor that one presumes. You know, let's wake up one day, I think I'll be a priest. It is a divine calling. Look at verse 4. No man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God. And then we'll talk about the just as Aaron was in just a moment. This is not a presumed, you have to be called by God. And of course, in Aaron's case, he had to be in the right family. So, now let's just stop there, and now let's move to the qualifications of Christ for the role of high priest. Here we will see that Christ fits perfectly both qualifications, divine appointment and solidarity with humanity, and they're going to be treated here in an opposite order. Now look at verse 4, and we're going to go right into actually I'm going to read verse 5 and 6. We'll talk about all of those here for just a few minutes. No man takes this honor to himself, but he's called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he, that would be God, who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." All right? So he's comparing. The first statement is, let me just get you through the simple piece here. The first piece is, you do not confer on yourself the honor of a priest. Aaron didn't, neither did Christ. All right? There is a calling that goes with that. Now, so he's putting the two together, Aaron and Christ. But now he's going to begin to show why Christ is superior. They both were called, but now he's going to start exalting the priesthood of Jesus and showing its superiority. Christ also did not assume the dignity of the high priest office was appointed by the Father. Verse 5, he did not glorify himself. God designated him as the Son and high priest. God called him, and then we get this little Old Testament quotation, for it was he who said, this comes right out of Psalm chapter 2, or the second Psalm, it is God who called him and said, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Now, let me take you back to Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1. This, again, I've said this several times, this recalls the truth that this whole book started with, and that is that God is a speaking God. God who in times past, look at Hebrews 1:1, who in times past and in various ways spoke to the prophets, or spoke to the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son. So again, we have a speaking God. We're back in chapter 5. The speaking God who said, "Today you are my son." Today, he did not confer this role of sonship and later priesthood on himself. "You are my," God declared it to be. Now, I want you to think with me. This is the little heavier part. There's not much heavy in this 5th chapter, but this would be the heaviest part. Christ's sonship has been the focal point of earlier chapters. And now we're going to look at his divinity. Peter O'Brien says that Psalm 2:7 is a declaration of appointment, not parentage. It's not, we kind of talked about that. It's not that he was created. He wasn't born. It's his appointment as my son, the Son of Man, Son of God. Before this text, or before the text was used, Psalm 2:7, to speak of his enthronement and the acclamation of his sonship, but now the author, with another quote, Psalm 110 and verse 4, that he puts here in Hebrews 5, the second quote, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. All right? So now he's mixing the two. I want you to follow me. All right? He's mixing these two quotes. One, he is proclaiming his sonship. But now he is also using that verse and another verse to proclaim his high priestly role. Not only are you my son, today I've begotten you, but you are a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, put the notes down for just a second because I'm just going to talk to you. And I want to remind you some things. Remember when we talked about that verse, today I've begotten you, and we even talked about some passages in Daniel about when Jesus passed into the heavens. This today I have begotten you has nothing to do with Bethlehem, the day Jesus was born. It has to do with the day that Jesus ascended and sat down at the Father's right hand. This day I've begotten you. I've appointed you now as to sit at my right hand. You are my son, all right? So when he passed back through the heavens, remember he said when he was being tried, some of you standing here will see the Son of Man coming in his glory. And we read those and we think that's the rapture. It's not. It's him ascending. His appointment, his enthronement. Now, look, this is really, so he's built this whole case about the enthronement of Jesus. And now he's saying he was enthroned, not just to sit there as the Son, but he was enthroned to be the priest after the order of Melchizedek. So he spent those first 4 chapters proving he's the Son who's enthroned. And now he's saying, let me tell you what he's doing while he's enthroned there. He is serving as your priest. He is the high priest. He is there on your behalf. He's not just there and we should be scared of him. He's there on our behalf. So some would say Psalm 110:4 was the only verse necessary here because it's about his priestly role. But the author wants a connection between the sonship of Jesus and his priesthood. The first 4 chapters were about the sonship, and we get to verse 14, seeing then that we have a great high priest who is touched with the feeling of our infirmities. Who is that great high priest? Jesus, the what? The Son of God. So now he's marrying those two concepts together. He who is the perfect Son of God from the beginning now has become the perfect high priest for us. That's the point that the author of Hebrews is making. All right? So he didn't appoint himself. Jesus didn't just say, well, I want to be the priest. The Father said, I'm appointing you. One is the Son, and now is the high priest. Now, let's go to verse 7. And the rest of this unfolds, I think, pretty easily as well. Verse 7, speaking of Jesus, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. So, Jesus also fulfills, so he fulfills the sonship. He fulfills the making sacrifices, but he also fulfills this solidarity with humanity requirement. And so now he begins to talk about the life of Jesus when he was here on earth. So what has been established already? We already know that he's a merciful and faithful high priest who has been made like his brothers and sisters in every respect. Go back to chapter 2. Look at verse 17 and 18. This is stuff we've already talked about. 17 and 18. Therefore, in all things, he was made like unto his brethren, so that he could be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, so that he could make propitiation for the sins of the people. So first of all, he's a merciful and faithful high priest who's been made like us in every respect. We also have established that he can sympatheo with us. We're on the top of page 4 in your notes, because that was chapter 4, verse 15 or 14. How can he sympathize with us? Because he was tried in all points, like as we. All right, so we've established that he's made like unto his brethren. We have established that he is sympathetic with us. And now what's going to happen is this is going to be further elaborated. Verse 7 begins that. This is the humanity of Jesus. See, the divinity of Jesus is established with his sonship. All right? But if, listen, everybody look at me for just a moment. If he's just the Son of God, sitting there at the Father's right hand, and he can't really feel what I feel, then he can't really be a priest who can sympathize. So now there's this elaboration. The author of Hebrews says, let me show you his humanity. Let me show you what he experienced. And so he describes it in verse 7. It says that he prayed earnestly with deep emotion. He was subject to weakness, not to sin. He wasn't subject, he didn't fall to sin, but he was subject to weakness. So let me just read verse 7 again of chapter 5. I want you to listen to it again. So in the days of his flesh, this is his humanity, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death and was heard because of his godly fear. Now, while there may be other times that the author is aware of, what does that clearly portray? That's Gethsemane. I mean, he is crying with and calling out to God, and he sweats drops of blood. That's the gospel writers tell us that. This is his humanity. And he's praying to the one. He offered up prayers. The Greek word is prospero. Also used in verse 1 and 3 about the high priest offering earthly sacrifices. But in Gethsemane, he prays out, cries out, he sweats drops of blood, and he's praying to the one who can save him from death. And let me just explain something. Some people say, well, he's praying to the one that could keep him from going to the cross. True. But he's also the one who raised him from death. He did save him from death. So the cross didn't nullify God's ability to save him from death. He was buried, and 3 days later, the Spirit of God raised him up. So he's crying out. This is just showing his humanity. This is Jesus and his humanity crying out to the one he knew was able to save him from death. This is a passionate prayer. And notice this at the end of verse 7. He was heard because of his godly fear. And that word is reverence. And I think what it's saying is, Father heard him because what did he do in Gethsemane? Not my will, but yours. His reverence was, you know what, I'm praying, but I'm surrendering to your will. All right? This again is so important. This is who is praying for us. All right? He's the eternal Son of God, but he's also the one that knows how to pray passionate prayers. He's still 100% human. He didn't quit being human when he went to the Father's right hand. He's 100% human, 100% God. So he didn't lose his ability to know how to intercede for us. You know, he is praying passionately for us. He knows how that feels. And he also knows the power of saying, but not my will, yours be done. Submitting to that. So this is an elaboration of his humanity. Now, verse 8... there's a couple of verses here in these last 2 or 3, verse 8 and 9, that make people stumble just a little bit. Though he was a son, capital S, yet he learned obedience through the things which he suffered. Now, literally, that phrase is literally son he was. That's how it reads in the Greek, but, you know, we don't speak that way in English. That maybe is, what is that, Yoda speak or something like that? Literally, son though he was, all right, we don't say it that way. So in our English translation, though he was a son, but literally, son though he was. So the article A is an addition for English reading. It was not in the original, so it's not a son. Son, implying the Son, capital S, though he was. So it would make sense, now just think about this, it would make sense that sons, plural, you and me, daughters, would learn obedience through suffering. That makes sense. I mean, how many have learned a lesson somewhere along the line through a failure? Anybody ever? Okay. So you've learned when you obey, things are better. When you disobey, everybody understand? Okay, so that would make sense. Chapter 12 is actually going to talk about that. The chapter 12 is going to say, whom the Father loves, he disciplines everyone. And no discipline in the moment is enjoyable, but it's grievous, it's painful, but afterwards it'll produce the peaceable fruits of righteousness. How many hope your kids and grandkids learn through their trials, all right? So that makes sense. But he's no ordinary son. Though son, you can even say, though son of God he was, verse 8, he learned obedience by the things which he had suffered. That's tough, all right? Let's see what we can do with that, all right? The sonship of Jesus, go back to chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. I just want to read to you how his sonship is described at the very beginning. Hebrews 1, 1 and 2. God, who at various times, various ways, spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son. Now look at how he describes his Son, who by whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom he made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and he upholds all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. I read that and I'm thinking, I don't know what he's got to learn, right? I mean, it's like, how could son though he was learn obedience through suffering? Hebrews 4:15 says, we talked about that last week, he was without sin. And if you look at what we just read to you or what we'll read later, actually flip to chapter 10. Let's confuse this a little bit more. Go to chapter 10, verses 5 through 10. Therefore, when he came into the world, this is Hebrews 10:5, he said, sacrifice and offering you don't desire, but a body you prepared for me, and burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you had no pleasure. And I said, behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written to do your will, O God. Okay, so let's talk about this. The Son, by whom are all things, who is the heir of all things, who sustains all things by the word of his power, who after he purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty of God, who is the brightness of God's glory and the express image of his person, who is without sin, Hebrews 4:15, and who when he came into the world, Hebrews 10 said, I delight to do your will, O God. What in the world does he need to learn about obedience? It seems like there is nothing for him to learn. So to learn obedience has to mean something other than what we would think it means. It means coming to appreciate fully what it meant to conform to the Father's will. Doesn't mean he had been disobedient. The focus is his faithfulness, how his will was tested. It was tested through suffering. He is praying in the garden. He never disobeyed. He didn't have to learn how to obey. He had to learn the full breadth of what it means to please the Father. In his humanity, he did. Never sinned, but in his humanity, he learned, when I submit to his will. I mean, even Hebrews 12, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. When he sees this church full and churches all around the world full on a Sunday morning, when he sees believers in Ukraine, in bomb shelters, worshiping God, it is the joy set before him. That's what he saw that enabled him to endure the cross. And as his life went, in his humanity, he learned more and more, as I submit to the Father's will, and I allow my will, not my will, he prayed. You can argue, well, he didn't have a will. Yes, he did. He prayed, not my will, but your will be done. And that, the learning obedience was learning how, when I submit my will to his, pleases the Father. It accomplishes the purpose. Steve? Exactly. He could not have related to us without the suffering. And he could not, the learning obedience, though, I really believe has to do with learning through his suffering how having conformed to the Father's will brings so much pleasure. Now, let me, you turn to page 5, because this is the point I want to make. If a son, though he was, learned to appreciate fully the will of the Father only through his suffering. Let me, we're kind of getting close to theological edges. Really not, but we're going places we don't normally go. But this is because the author of Hebrews takes us there. Jesus in his humanity could not have fully understood, walking around as a 12-year-old or a 17-year-old or a 22-year-old, not in his humanity, could he have fully understood what it meant to fully submit to the Father's will. He couldn't yet. He did, but he couldn't get the impact of that. I mean, he felt a little bit of it at 12 when his parents said, well, where were you? I had to be about my Father's business. I'm sure in his humanity, it's like, this is what it feels like to conform to the Father's will. I'm sure he felt some of that at 31 and 32 when he resisted being a king. But he's really at crunch time in Gethsemane. And that's the text that's being used. He's praying out, he's agonizing in prayer. And then he says the words, but I'm going to conform to your will, not my will, but yours be done. And it was through that suffering that, today the son looks at the people in their Ukraine bomb shelter who are worshiping him with their hands up, and he is saying, man, it was so worth it. I learned that through my suffering. I couldn't learn it at 12 or 17, but through my suffering, I learned the beauty of conforming to the Father's will. So if that is the case for the Son, he couldn't really appreciate fully the will of the Father. And we know his will is to bring many sons and daughters to glory. Does it not stand to reason that our suffering, as well as the suffering of the Hebrews, is profitable to help us conform to the Father's will too? Instead of naming and claiming it all away, we should be allowing it to conform us to the Father's will. He didn't name it and claim it away. He said, no, your will be done. You've got a purpose in this. That's pretty rich stuff right there in that verse, all right? It couldn't mean that Jesus had to learn how to obey, because he never said. That obedience is learning the pleasure of pleasing the Father. It's exactly what he learned here. Now, look at verse 9, because it throws another little kink in the, or wrench in the, I don't know, whatever metaphor you want to use. Look at verse number 9. We're almost done. Chapter 5 and verse 9. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Again, go back to 2:10. Remember, we had a pretty lengthy discussion, Hebrews 2:10, about the same thing back in Hebrews 2:10. For it was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. Remember, again, why would you need to make perfect someone who would never sin? All right? So it's not moral perfection in the sense of sin. But if you remember this discussion we had, we understood it in the terms of vocation. And not vocation as in I'm a tool grinder or a preacher or an attorney or a whatever. Vocation as in, what has God called me to do? What is my called vocation? All right? Jesus' called vocation was to be the Redeemer of humanity. That's what, and so that vocation had to be perfected in him, and through suffering, through Gethsemane, where he had a choice to not go through with the vocation. That all had to be perfected. Again, suffering to save his calling, suffering to save his vocation. And he became the source of our salvation, the same as the word pioneer that we see in chapter 2 and verse 10. So go back to Hebrews 5, verse 9. Having been perfected, he became the author or the pioneer of our eternal salvation because he was perfected, he fulfilled his vocation. He fulfilled his calling. Having fulfilled his calling, having been perfected, having fulfilled his vocation, he then was able to become the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. And again, redemption is secured through the blood of Jesus, but our obedience and our submission by faith to him makes that effective in our lives. And then in verse 10, this appointment, because this is all about his appointment. Let me summarize before I read verse 10. So, earthly priests had to have solidarity with humanity, and they had to do things pertaining to God for humanity, intermediary. That's how, and they had to be appointed. They couldn't just, didn't confer that honor on themselves. That was the first part. Now Jesus, the author says, let me tell you how he became priest. God appointed him not only a son, it's almost like I really do think this was a sermon before it was a letter, because this was a good sermon. I mean, I'm telling you, he built this thing. It was a really good one because he builds a point. He says, I've already told you he's son. Now let me add to that sonship. You remember, it's like the writer of Hebrews. Remember when he passed through the heavens and I told you that he was enthroned? Now let me tell you why he's enthroned. Not only is he son, he's priest. And he's a priest that learned how much it pleased the Father to do his will by his suffering. And he was perfected in that vocation through that suffering. And now he is a high priest for all of you who will obey him. And then he throws out the little after the order of Melchizedek. And as a good preacher would do, closes the book and says, come back next Sunday and I'll tell you what Melchizedek means. I really think that's what he did, all right? So my point is, in verse 10 then, he affirms it, called by God as a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. He will pick that up. You can just look over in your Bibles. Look at chapter 7 and verse 1. Actually, look at chapter 6, verse 20, where the forerunner is entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And then in chapter 7 and verse 1, for this Melchizedek. So he's going to pick that back up. But there's going to be all this stuff from chapter 5, verse 11 to chapter 6, verse 20. Pastor Kevin would call it a sidebar. I'm going to take a little sidebar and we'll come back to it. That's exactly what he is doing. And now let me just read you my conclusion. Before he tells us what kind of priest Jesus is and what it means to be after the order of Melchizedek, and just keep in mind, that's after the order of Melchizedek instead of after the order of Aaron, all right? Because that's what they've got. They've got to understand he's not like Aaron. Before he does that, though, he is going to issue a strong warning and a strong exhortation about their sluggishness. And so I just gave you a little quote from Gareth Cockerill. It's really good. And again, he believes, too, by the way, that this was a sermon because he calls the author the pastor. He says, the pastor, however, is concerned that his hearers are condoning a certain spiritual lethargy and complacency that will prevent their approaching the glorious significance of these truths and thus keep them from achieving the all-important perseverance necessary for final salvation. Thus, before going further, he must address this laxity in 5:11 through 6:20 so that they might truly grasp and appropriate what he has to say. He would not have them to be ignorant of Christ's sufficiency and thus go astray. Remember in chapter 2, he said, give the more earnest heed to the things which you've heard lest you drift away. He doesn't want them to drift away, but he is afraid that they will never appropriate the priesthood of Jesus if they get lazy and sluggish and fall back on God. So he is going to rebuke them. He's going to exhort them. He's going to encourage them, get them back on track, and then he is going to explain what the priesthood of Jesus after the order of Melchizedek really means.